We are here on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and also in the riding of Toronto-St. Paul's. Now, this building behind us, the Artscape Witchwood Barns, is an anchor for this community. It's a testament to the determination and ambition of a community and what can happen when it works together with various levels of government to get important things done. These were derelict barns for many years that have now been converted into an environmentally friendly green space with artists, with multiple uses for people in the community of various incomes. And it really demonstrates what we can do when we work together. Toronto-St. Paul's is a community that is very close to me and my family. I spent much of my childhood growing up here in the schools in this neighborhood. My mother taught in this neighborhood, and many of my immediate family live in this neighborhood. And it's exactly why I am so concerned to have heard about the recent anti-Semitic attacks that have happened in the last day or two. Beth Shalom is a synagogue in Toronto, St. Paul's that was defaced by graffiti. This is a synagogue actually that I have been at more than once for the bar and bat mitzvahs of friends of mine who attended a school not too far away from here. As a federal leader and as a Jewish person, I'm extremely concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism. I was very saddened and concerned to hear about the defacing of posters of 2 Liberal candidates in Montreal. And so let me say now what I always say, which is that anti-Semitism has no place. It should have no room to grow in Canada. We need to denounce it collectively. We need to call out hate whenever we see it. Silence emboldens the hate. And members of the Jewish community are counting on every person in Canada to raise their voice whenever these incidents happen. Il faut travailler ensemble pour combattre la haine. On ne doit pas avoir place pour la haine ici au Canada. On voit que les actes d'haine continuent à augmenter, à monter, et il faut absolument insister qu'on n'a pas de silence quand on fait face à ces incidents. I also wanted to briefly mention a situation which continues to unfold and which has got to remain front and center on the minds of people in Canada, and that is the situation in Afghanistan. We heard yesterday from our Prime Minister in his own words that it would be now virtually impossible for Canada to rescue the Afghan people who helped our military and their families, given that the Taliban has completely taken over Afghanistan, given that they control the borders and the checkpoints. And this was a completely foreseeable situation. Our veterans warned about this situation, and yet Mr. Trudeau and his government did nothing. They did nothing to ensure the security and safe passage of Afghans at a time when it was still possible to do. Instead, what he did was he called this election. He called an election. He strode out of Rideau Hall, having just been briefed on the terrifying situation on the ground. And he went out and decided that the best use of his time and his Minister of Defense was to travel the country fighting an election instead of fighting for the lives of our friends and allies who helped us in Afghanistan. And so I called for an emergency leaders debate on this issue, and I'm calling for one again, exactly because this is not the way we treat our allies. This is not the way we treat our friends who have put their lives in danger in order to be of help and of service to people here in Canada. Those are not our values. And so I ask us not to forget about the people who have been stranded and left behind in Afghanistan, and to insist that there is a plan that ensures that we speed up visas, that we get safe passage, and that the Taliban receives no recognition from our government whatsoever until they guarantee respect for fundamental human rights and the safe passage and exit for every Afghan helper and their families. Alors, il faut assurer qu'il y a un plan pour les familles et les personnes qui restent en Afghanistan. qui méritent notre protection exactement parce qu'ils ont protégé nos soldats. On sait que nos anciens combattants, ils ont sonné l'alarme. Ils ont sonné l'alarme et notre Premier ministre a décidé que c'était plus important d'aller chercher les votes ici au Canada au lieu d'aller chercher et sauver les vies de les personnes, nos alliés et les personnes qui nous ont aidés en Afghanistan. C'était tout à fait prévisible. On a reçu beaucoup de préavis. On ne peut pas abandonner nos alliés en ce moment en Afghanistan. J'invite encore les chefs de tous les partis majeurs fédéraux de participer dans un débat d'urgence sur la situation en Afghanistan qui se déroule en ce moment. This is a bit of a roller coaster of a press conference, but it was so important to mention those two things today. And today we are going to be talking briefly about clean tech, myself and Phil. We talked the other day about our green future. We talked the other day about the fact that climate change is here. Climate change has arrived. We see it in the hundreds of forest fires that are burning across the country. We see it in the hundreds, and the number continues to mount. The over 600 Canadians who lost their lives in just 3 days during the heat dome that settled in British Columbia. We see it in the floods. We see it in the historic drought that has settled on the prairies that is withering crops in the field. And so we know that climate change is real, that climate change is here, and that we must act with determination, with ambition, and as quickly as possible with the tools that we have and the tools that we will create. On sait que la crise climatique est ici. Il faut agir d'une manière d'urgence. Nous avons tout ce qu'il faut pour le faire et on voit que c'est quelque chose qui doit être une des enjeux principes de cette élection. So the Green Party never mentions a problem without talking about the solutions. Nous sommes le parti d'innovation, d'idées, et nous allons toujours proposer les politiques les plus innovateurs pour les plus grands défis. And so that's what we're about today. With Phil's help, we're going to be introducing some of these key elements in order to get us to net zero as quickly as possible. And why is that so important to get to net zero as quickly as possible? Because we know that any little bit that we can limit our warming, any little bit that we can keep the degrees of warming from increasing in Canada, the more we protect ourselves from even more intense heat domes, even more intense droughts, even more intense weather and climate events. Alors, chaque fraction de degré est énormément important. Il faut assurer qu'on limite au maximum possible notre réchauffement planétaire, exactement parce qu'on veut éviter des événements plus intenses et plus fréquents. And so what are some of the elements to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible? Here are some of those elements here. We protect what we have. We know that we have carbon sinks. For instance, our trees that are an enormous source of decarbonization. We need to protect the forests that we have. We need to protect our old growth. And of course, we need to plant. And I'm telling you that if we don't get started on planting those 2 billion trees that have been promised for years and years by the Conservatives, I'm going to grab my kids and a couple of greens and some shovels and just get, planting myself, because we've waited long enough for those 2 billion trees. Renewables everywhere. Canada's electricity grid is one of the good news stories for Canada in terms of our decarbonization. We are 80% of the way there. 80% de notre énergie est des sources renouvelables. Alors, qu'est-ce que nous allons faire pour atteindre l'autre 20%? We have to make sure that we get to that 20% as quickly as possible, because as the IPCC said, the UN panel on climate change said clearly, the future is renewable energy. The future is in renewable energy. And then we need to take that electrification and make the best use of it possible. We need to make sure that we are putting it to good use by decarbonizing our transportation, by decarbonizing our building sectors as well. This is an area where Canada can be a global leader. This is an area where we can work with the United States as well. C'est possible pour Canada d'être au premier rang de pays qui utilisent leur énergie renouvelable pour décarboniser le reste de la société. Tackling industrial emissions, agriculture, steel, cement, other products, all of these things contribute to our quality of life, and all of these things emit. All of these things require deep decarbonization as well. And we need new technologies that do not yet exist, and Phil's going to talk more about that. Et finalement, la science et l'innovation. Non, c'est un enjeu Phil pour élaborer, mais le Canada a la possibilité d'être encore au premier rang d'innovation et science si on décide d'investir. Unfortunately, Canada at this moment has the second lowest investment in research and development, the second lowest in the G7. We know that innovation is an engine for our economy. We know that the countries that invest the most in innovation are the ones that are going to be the most competitive in the future. I said it before, and I will say it again. We are in a global green rush. There was a gold rush, and now there's a green rush. Every country is positioning themselves to be at the head of that green rush, to have the strongest green economy focused on renewable energy and on research and innovation to get us over the finish line. So if we want to stay competitive in that green rush, we need to do it now, and we need to invest in it. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Phil for a couple of minutes. Phil, as I said, is our candidate here in Toronto St. Paul's. He has a PhD in material sciences. He is the youngest director ever at the National Research Council. He is incredibly committed to this community of Toronto St. Paul's. He is exactly what we are talking about when we were recruiting through our Time to Run campaign, to have a diverse, incredibly gifted, incredibly committed, incredibly experienced slate of candidates. And he, of course, is going to be able to share a little bit more about how these key elements, all of these things together, combined with political will, combined with the ambition and determination of the people of Canada, can ensure that when we have our next election, that Canada is known globally as a leader in research and development, in deep decarbonization, in reducing greenhouse gases, because we are not going to leave the future to pay for the decisions we delayed today. We are going to make sure that in the future, we have not abandoned our country to worse and worse climate and weather-related events because of the things that we did not do when we had the opportunity to do it. And with that, I'll pass it over to Phil.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I'd like to echo Annamie's statements around anti-Semitism. There is no place for hate in Toronto St. Paul's, and I absolutely condemn all of these terrible, terrible acts that have occurred in our community over the last couple of days. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Phil DeLuna. I am a scientist and a clean tech innovator. I moved to Canada from the Philippines when I was 5 years old. I was raised in Windsor, Ontario. My dad was an auto worker. My mom worked in customer service. They couldn't give me much, but they could give me an education. And they always told me that people can take away things from you, but they can never take away what you know. I used this, and I learned from an early age that education would be my pathway to a better life, a life worthy of their sacrifice. I earned a PhD from the University of Toronto in materials science and engineering. I became a finalist in the Carbon X Prize, a $20 million competition to capture and convert the most CO2 into a useful product. I became the youngest ever director at the National Research Council, where I led a $57 million program to develop new technologies to decarbonize Canada. I know exactly what it takes to get to this net zero future. I know exactly what it takes to go from discovery to market. My job is to go from innovation to impact. I know how much time and money we need to invest in the next generation of clean technologies, the next generation that will decarbonize our world and our society. We have heard what will happen if we do not decarbonize. We are experiencing today heat waves and forest fires. But I want to take the opportunity to talk about this transition in a different light. The opportunity that it represents for Canada. How Canada can lead and become the superpower in the green economy of the future, which will be the economy of the future. There is much at stake. In 2008, my father lost his job at Ford during the Great Recession, at the fall of the automotive industry. I know exactly what it's like to grow up in a community that is dependent on one industry and what happens when that industry fades away. That exact same thing is happening in today's oil and gas and heavy emission industries, but we can stop it and we can change it. The good news is that these workers have exactly the skills that we need to transition to a green economy. We need welders and pipe fitters and electricians and technicians with deep expertise in how to move things around and fluid mechanics and fluids. They can usher us into this new green economy. We need to make sure that every family and every job and every person has a clean energy destination to transition to. Finally, I want to end on a note of optimism. As a young person, our generation and those after us will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. It's up to us to act now. We are ready to provide solutions. We are ready to get to work. We are ready to be the climate leaders that Canada needs now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And let me tell you this, there's a lot more where that came from in the Green Party this year. Take a look at our candidates. They have the solutions, we have the solutions, and we also have the talent to bring those solutions to light. Et avec ça, je suis prêt pour les questions. With that, I'm ready for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. I believe we're going straight to questions online. If there are any journalists on this call who would like to ask a question of Ms. Paul or Mr. De Luna, please use the raised hand feature to let us know. Bonjour, on va aller à les questions sur Zoom. S'il y a des questions, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction de lever la main pour signaler que vous voulez demander une question. Are there any questions, please? Currently no questions online. Il n'y a pas de questions online. Thank you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for being with us here today, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much again to Phil and to all the Greens for welcoming us here in Toronto, St. Paul's.
Thank you, Ms. Paul and Mr. De Luna. This will end today's press conference. Merci, Madame Paul and Monsieur De Luna.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This concludes today's press conference with the leader of the Green Party Canada, Annamie Paul, and guest speaker, Phil De Luna.